All right. Cool. Okay. So here's what we're going to need. And again, tried to give you guys as good descriptions as I could for each function and each line of code you're going to write. It's all right here. There's something that we'll talk about in a few weeks called user stories. Does anyone know what a user story is, or has anyone written user stories, maybe in a previous job or working with other developers, collaborating with other people? Has anyone used a user story or know what it is?
Isn't it literally just the user story? So how the person will be using, well, how you imagine the user to be using said product?
Yeah, that's a really good description. So a user story, it's essentially that measure twice, cut once. It's another way that we can think about, before we even write a line of code, let's break down what features do we want our app to have. I'm going to want the user to log in. I'm going to want the user to register for this site. When they log into this site, I want them to be able, like in this example, I want them to be able to click the start game button and a new game is instantiated, things like that. So it's a way of breaking down kind of very similar to pseudocoding, but even before we pseudocode, we would think about the features, the really important features that we want our app to have, and then we'd break those down into even smaller components. And you just try to break down, it's a way of pre-planning your application. And there's a couple of project management tools that we'll talk about. So once you break it down into very smaller components, because it's very intimidating just to see a game like this and be like, all right, good luck, go out there and build it. But if you break it down, which is what we did here in the README, it's actually very digestible, really small parts. And so it's kind of like pre-planning your code. We'll talk more about user stories in the future, but it's a really great way to plan out your application, because maybe if you're working on a team, I could be, hey, Audrey, why don't you work on this user story of logging in a user? And I'm going to work on this user story of, when I click the button, the game is instantiated. And then some other team member may work on the log out feature for our app. So when you plan out your app that way, you can also, assign the features, the user stories, to other people. It's a great way to, kind of share the workload. Anywho, this is kind of in the spirit of a user story, the way this README is broken down. So let's start right here. So what we're going to need, as far as the data goes, we're going to need to create an array of 10 tiles. The 10 tiles are going to represent the letter values that will be displayed on each DOM tile. So essentially, we're going to have 2 A's, 2 B's, 2 C's, 2 D's, and 2 E's, right? So we're going to create the data array. And then for functions, I'm not going to read through all of these. Let's just tackle, we'll tackle the first 2 together, and then I'll put you guys in our breakouts. So the one thing we're going to need is this window onload function, which is what Colin mentioned yesterday. So what does the window onload function do for us? Why would we want to use that function, or that method, actually, on window?
To make sure to not run the game until everything's been loaded, that's
Yeah, exactly. So if we're writing JavaScript that depends on the DOM elements being rendered, if our browser reads the script before the DOM has completed building, then the JavaScript is going to be out of sync and it's going to fail. So window onload is a method that says, hey, don't run this code until the entire DOM or the entire window has been created. That DOM document object model has been created. Then we can attach things like event listeners and other information to those DOM elements. That's particularly important in this case because we really don't have any HTML. We're using JavaScript to append all the cards, to create all the cards. We're going to use JavaScript to insert a win message, when you're finished with the game. So it's very important. For example, if we're going to append some cards to this game, we need this div to be rendered in the DOM before we can start appending stuff to it. So window.onload is kind of like a fail-safe to make sure that our script runs at the appropriate time. And if you look in your starter code, actually we have kind of a scaffolded the window onload, and we're going to put some stuff in there. The other thing that is already kind of given to you is this shuffle function. So it's funny because in Ruby, there's a .shuffle method that makes it really easy to shuffle arrays. JavaScript doesn't have a nice user-friendly way to do that. So this is actually a function. If you Google JavaScript shuffle arrays, this will probably be the first thing that comes up. So this is just some code that is from Stack Overflow, or actually this is probably in the MDN documentation as well. It's kind of a standard way to shuffle a collection of things. So that's already given to you here. And also, we are going to create one big object called game. And this game object is going to contain all of our properties and methods. So we're going to get a little bit more practice with calling methods and properties within an object. So that's already scaffolded out for you. Let's just take a look at these two functions we're going to build first. So for our window onload function, this is what it needs to contain. So we're going to write the JavaScript that will select the start game button element from the DOM. Then we're going to assign that button DOM object to a variable. So before we can even attach some sort of click event to start the game, we need to grab that object from the DOM. And so we're going to create a variable and use a document.body, and we're going to grab that specific button so we can attach stuff to it. After we do that, we're going to attach a click event listener to that variable. And then finally, inside the window.onload, we're going to add a console log started and invoke the start function, just to make sure that our stuff's working. Again, console logs are a great way just to kind of test out and debug your code. So these are the 4 things that we're going to add to our window.onload function to get started. The other function that we're going to create, I'll get you guys started on this, is the actual start function. So once we click that start button right here, it's going to fire the start function, the start method, because we're going to attach it to the game object. But that start method is going to build out the game board essentially. So if I refresh this, initially the game board is not there until we click the start game. So that's what we're going to build with that start function, a start method. And that's going to shuffle the tiles array that we're going to create. And then it's also going to call a make and display tiles method to build and display the game board. So the start method is actually going to call another method. And so we're going to get that started as well. This make and display tiles is a pretty hardy method, but we're going to get through it. And then here are the other methods that you're going to want to build. The make play, where you pass in the tile. Check for match. So once you click on 2 tiles, that method is going to see if those 2 tiles are a match. Are they both A tiles or B tiles, that kind of thing. And then the check for win. So once you've, I think that one, once we actually select the 10 tiles, then that will display the "you're a winner" message that we're going to put into the DOM. So any questions before we start coding this out? All right, so I'm going to have you guys kind of walk me through this as we get started. So let's start with the first thing right here. So we're going to need to create a data array of 10 tiles. So if you want to put this into Slack, again, this game variable, this is going to be the object that's going to contain all of our methods and properties. So how would I add we'll call it tiles. So I want you guys, put it into Slack when you finish it, create an array of tiles in our game object and have it have those 10 letters. So we want 2 A letters, 2 B letters. And that tiles array is going to be what we shuffle each time to mix up the cards and keep them random. So see if you can create a property called tiles inside our game object to get started, and that'll satisfy our first objective here. And then give me a thumbs up in Slack when you're done. Or if you get it, go ahead and paste in your approach into Slack and we'll take a look. But create a tiles So create a tiles property inside your game object. And it needs to be an array of those 10 letters. Cool. Yeah, it's looking good, guys. Yeah, Alejandra. So go ahead and do this. Actually, paste in the entire game object. So that does look good as far as the property. But paste in the entire game object. Let me see how you created that. Because Alejandra's super close, but I think you have a semicolon at the end. And if we're going to add other methods and properties, we definitely want a comma. Yeah, so Alan, yeah, it looks really good, Alan. So yeah, Alejandra, if you just put a comma at the end, I think you'll be in good shape there. Yeah, nice. Cool, so then we'll be ready to add other methods and such. Very cool. Let me share my screen and let me pop that into my code base. And I'll share all my finished code before I put you into breakouts, just in case anyone's missing it. So yeah, this looks really good. So essentially what we want to do is, again, we're going to add all of this new stuff, into our game object. So we're going to create a property called tiles, and that's going to be an array of so we just want 2 for each, right? B, C, D, E, and E. Very nice. So these are going to represent our 10 tiles. And this is actually going to be the only property in this object, just kind of a preview. Everything else we create is going to be a method. That's really nice. Very excellent work. So looks like we have the data taken care of. So we have our tiles. So that takes care of the first bullet point right there. So very nice work. Here's the next thing we're going to do. Let's move on to the window onload. Let's fill that out. So put that screenshot into Slack. And actually, what I would recommend doing, when I send you guys the solution code later tonight or Friday, if we need to push this to Friday, I literally copied each line in this README and put it right next to the code that you need. So I think when you go back and look at this, it's pretty descriptive. But what I would suggest doing, if it's helpful, copy those bullets and actually just pop them into this function if it helps you. And of course, you need to comment them out. But each bullet point is going to be, this is, kind of quasi pseudo coding what we need. So the first thing we're going to write is we're going to invoke the chain of functions and listeners within the window. Well, we're going to do that throughout this whole thing. The first thing we're going to write is write the JavaScript that will select the start game button element from the DOM. So I want you guys to work on that. What's the first thing we would need to write here to grab that element from the DOM? Actually, we'll combine these two. So how would you grab that element from the DOM and then go ahead and assign it to a variable? So if you want to, call the variable start button or something. And I would suggest the way to test that out is Well, one thing you can you can literally go into the index.html and you can probably figure out how you'd want to grab the button. But if you didn't have the HTML, what you could do, if you want to go ahead and open this in Chrome. So for those of you that installed the Atom package open in browser, that browser I think is open in browser plugin. If you're inside this file, you can hit the control key and click, and then scroll down to open in browser, and that will open that index.html file in the browser of choice. So right here is kind of the starter code, because when I click on start game, nothing's happening, right? We haven't gotten that far yet. But we looked at the other day how we could go into the console and you could start writing the code to practice grabbing that DOM element, very similar to what you guys did with the Jedi exercise, right? So I know that I'm going to need to start with like a document dot something. And then you can practice with that to try to grab that button that lives here in the DOM. So we'll get some good practice with their dev tools today for sure. So when you get that working, go ahead and give me a, well, I put like 4 bullets into Slack. But if you get this working, create a variable and grab that start button and assign it, go ahead and put that into Slack. So that'll be the next thing we do. Actually, that'll kill 2 birds right there. So I'll go ahead and give you a, I'm going to call this like start button, for example. That seems like a pretty descriptive, good variable naming for what we're trying to grab. And then what is the JavaScript we can put to there? Cool, so Alan has var start button document dot query selector button. Very nice. Yeah, that'll work actually. Let me grab that. And there's probably more than one way to do that. Let me give you this as like a little bit of an extra challenge. Well, we don't have an ID on that. Yeah, luckily in this example, we only have one button on the page. So we can use that generic button tag to grab the button. But if we had a couple of buttons like start game or I don't know, maybe if we're keeping track of all the scores, if we wanted to like reset the scores, if we had more than one button, it probably makes sense to go in here and like maybe add an ID for start button. But since we only have one button, that's totally cool. That's how IDs can come in really handy, is if you want to add a JavaScript event to like one specific element in the DOM, one specific object, IDs would be very helpful there. Cool, that looks great. So we've got a var start button, and then this is how we would grab it from the DOM with the query selector. Very nice. So let's move on to this next one. So now that we have it assigned to a variable, let's attach a click event listener to that variable. So Colin walked you guys through that yesterday. So what would be the code to attach a click listener to that start button? And a little bit of a preview. I think yesterday when Colin walked you guys through this, so an add event listener, remember that you pass in the name of the event, and then you can pass in an anonymous function for what you want to happen when that event fires. In this app, we're actually going to build a separate named function called start. We're going to have it in our game object. So we're not going to put an anonymous function as the callback. We're actually going to call that very specific method that we'll create here shortly. So no need to pass in an anonymous function for this event listener. And we'll code that out if that's a little wonky. We'll take a look at why we're doing that. Let's see if you can attach a click event listener to the variable. You can Google, you can check out the lesson from yesterday, or I would Google JavaScript add event listener to an element, something like that. Yeah, this is looking good. So yeah, so Alejandro, you're super close, but we've already assigned start button. So at that point, Alan looks pretty, yeah, Alan's looks pretty good. So we can just call that add event listener method and attach it to start button, and then pass in the click event of passing the event that we want to attach to it. In this case, a click event, and then pass in the function. Yeah, that looks really good. So let's build that out. So this was Alan's, what he put into Slack. So yeah, let's do start button. Now, we didn't necessarily have to assign this to a variable, but there's a couple of advantages to that. So let's say that we wanted to chain, I think you guys saw this yesterday. So if we wanted to chain different methods and properties to the start button, it makes sense to assign it to a variable. So then we can just, chain .style or add multiple event listeners, whatever we wanted to do. Otherwise, we could have just done, document.querySelector.add event listener. It would have been the same thing. The really great, it doesn't really matter for this game, but one great advantage to assigning these objects to a variable is because JavaScript only has to find this object one time and attach it to this variable name. Then we can change stuff on top of it. If we were going to chain or add like 3 or 4 different properties to this, we could do something like this and do like, dot style, and then like, add event listener if we wanted. Misspelled that. I mean, you could do it line by line without assigning it to a variable. However, it's very expensive because each line, JavaScript has to store in memory this version, and this version. But if we assign it to a variable and then attach new methods and properties to this variable, it only has to store it in memory once, and then it can just attach new things to that stored object in memory. So just FYI, again, for like a small game like this, it doesn't really matter, but going forward, that is one great advantage to storing it into a variable. Okay, so let's add an event listener. And for this one, we're going to do click, and then we're going to call the start method, which we haven't created yet. We'll create that shortly. But yeah, that looks good. Any questions about these 3 steps? So we have one more step to go here. And to do that, we're going to add the start method inside of our game object. So go ahead and work on this last bullet point. So create a start method inside the game object specifically. And for now, just add a console log started, just so we can test out that it's working. So go ahead and add that to your game object. Then we're going to go back and refactor this just a little bit. I know we are creating the start method, but is it safe to think of it, safe to think it is acting as a callback, or is that complicated? Yeah, it's the same thing. There's a couple of advantages. Well, one reason we're doing it this way is because this is what you went over yesterday. There's other ways to add click events to variables or to objects, but I'm trying to be consistent with what you guys covered yesterday. So yeah, so the add event listener takes a callback. There are certain advantages to having a named function. So you could have done this and then put information in here. But there's a very specific reason why we're setting it up this way, other than that's how you did it yesterday. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole right now, but if you look in the bonus section, so once you click on 2 cards and you get a match, one of the bonuses is to turn off that click event handler on the matched cards. Because the way that the game is set up now, I can just keep clicking, even though I have a match, I can keep clicking on those 2 cards. It doesn't break my app or anything, but if I wanted to keep track of like click events, so maybe I want to keep a high score, like who solved this puzzle with the least amount of clicks. If I can keep clicking on a found card, you know, maybe it's going to mess up my scoring or something. But here's the thing, if you go through the documentation, if you want to remove an event listener from an object, you have to attach it to an object using add event listener. You also, it won't remove an anonymous function. So if I added the callback like this, and then I tried to remove it later, JavaScript can't do that. It needs a named function to remove it. So I'm just being a little like preemptive here, because if you want to do the bonuses, we want to make sure that we add the event listeners using the add event listener method, so you can remove it using the remove event listener method. So it's just a little kind of quirky thing in JavaScript. So that's why we're doing it that way. Very good question. Yeah, so once you create that basic start method inside our game object, go ahead and pop that into Slack. So we'll finish building out the start method, and then I'll put you guys in a breakout and have you play around with the make and display tiles function. So Alan has function start, console log started. So that looks pretty good, but remember that we're gonna make this start method, where a method is a function that's inside an object, right? So it looks like the start method looks good, but how would we write that if we were inserting it into our game object? We'd write it just a little bit differently. But yeah, the kind of the inner workings of that looks really good. But how would we write it to add it to our game object? Yeah, I originally put it in there, but it says start wasn't defined when I ran it. Yeah, that's the next step we're gonna do. So how do we call methods and properties inside an object? How would we do that? If we're going to call a method called start from our game object, what would we need to change this to right here? Yeah, so that looks good, Alan. So let's put that in first. So yeah, let's create a start method here. So it's going to be start, that's the name of the method, and then it's going to be an anonymous function. And then let's just console log started. Very nice. So what Alan's referring to, let's go ahead and refresh this. And then let's check out the console. Uncaught reference error, start is not defined. So we're going to need to refactor this line right here. So this start function, it's not in the global scope, right? It's inside of an object. So how do we get to objects and properties inside an object? What would we need to change this to right here? Yeah, nice. Yeah, so now it's not just start, it's actually game.start, right? Because start is a method inside the game object. So we'll call game.start, and then JavaScript will know where to find that start method. So let's save that and refresh, and let's see if it barks at us now. So now when I click start game, yeah, we should see started. Try that one more time. Get out of their document attribute. Cool. Yeah, so right now we're getting loaded and started. And actually it's going ahead and calling that method, which is fine, but either way. So when we put the parentheses on here, it's going ahead and invoking that function when it loads, as opposed to removing the parens, and then it won't fire until we actually click on it. So that would actually probably be the way to go, because when we first load the game, we want to be able to click on the button before it fires. So yeah, very nice work. So that looks great. Let me, I'm going to move this line, just bump it right down here to document our stuff. So inside this function, add a console log started and invoke the start function. So here's just some documentation for what we've done so far. Cool. Does anyone need this code? I'll put this into Slack just in case you need it. Cool. So that code satisfies that first window on load section of our documentations. That's really good. Let's knock out this start method. Let's finish that out, and then I'll put you guys into breakouts and let you work on this make and display tiles. So the start method, we've already instantiated it. Let's just add some more juice to it. So when we call that start method, we want to shuffle the tiles array and then call make and display tiles to build and display the game board. So take a stab at that. How would you approach that here with the start function? And it's also going to call make and display tiles. So we probably need to at least create that method to get us started, right? So you're going to add that method to your game object. So go ahead and work on those 2 bullet points for a second. And actually, let me do one more thing. Let's go ahead and move this shuffle function inside of our object so you can call it. So this will be, we want to put all of our logic in here. So let me just refactor this a little bit. So I'm going to create a shuffle method and then do that. Cool. So if you guys can see that, all I did is move that shuffle method inside of my game object. So now you can call that amongst the other methods, because you'll need to call it inside the start function, the start method right here. So this is what I did. If you're interested, I just changed like 2 words. Cool, so we're working on 2 lines of code. We want to shuffle the tiles array and then call make and display tiles to build and display the game board. So don't worry about building out the insides of make and display tiles, but you could just, you know, create the shell of it if you wanted. And then if you get the shuffle working, go ahead and put that into Slack. So how would we shuffle that tiles array? What would that look like? You guys are going to love it when we get to Ruby, because Ruby has so many great helper methods that JavaScript just doesn't have. So we had to create a shuffle function here, but Ruby already gives you a dot shuffle out of the box, which is really nice. Cool, so we've got, so Alan adds shuffle this dot tiles, make and display tiles. Let's pop that in here. So shuffle this dot tiles. Make and display tiles. This is super close. How do we access other methods and properties inside of an object? So we talked about scope last week, right? So functions have local scope. So when you're saying this dot tiles, what is this looking for? Is this referring to this function local scope, or is this referring to like the outer scope?
Local scope, right?
Right. So this dot tiles is looking for a tiles variable inside this function. So that's super close. One thing to keep in mind is that you have to write some fancy code to make sure that objects don't, unless you're creating creating a constructor function to instantiate and create new objects, object literals don't have scope associated with them. But what we could do right here, instead of this, we can call game.tiles, right? So then what would we need to add to shuffle to grab the shuffle method?
Same thing, game.shuffle.
For sure. Yeah. So grab the shuffle method inside the game object, and then grab the tiles property, which is an array, inside the game object as well. And keeping in that same thinking, what will we need to do to this make and display tiles? Which we haven't even created that yet, but I'll do that right here. So there's kind of the rough shell of that make and display tiles function. So if I wanted to call that, what would I need to do right here on line 33?
Be game.make and display tile.
Perfect. Very nice. Yeah, so remember that we're doing this on purpose. We're putting everything into this object so you guys can start thinking about and get practice with, if you're trying to grab properties and methods inside of some other function or method here, you're going to need to do the game dot first, because we're essentially grabbing this outer game and then whatever methods or properties is attached to it. So keep that in mind when you're working on here. And again, just to recap, this dot tiles won't work because this is referring to the local scope of this function. So if we had a variable tiles in here, so this dot tiles would refer to this tiles, which is inside the local scope of this function. But game.tiles refers to the tiles property on this object up here. So it refers to this one. Very cool. All right, so you guys have the shells of the well, we finished the window.onload. We pretty much finished the start method. You guys will just need to continue with the make and display tiles method right here, which is kind of the next step. So any questions about what we've done so far? I'm happy to Slack out this code again as we go into breakouts if you don't quite have it. But what I'd like you guys to do is we'll take maybe 20 minutes and I want you guys to see how far you can get. I'll just put these next 3 in here. I don't know if you guys will get through all 3 in 20 minutes, but just see how far you can get. And then we'll come back after about 20 minutes and then we'll build we'll walk through building as far as you guys got. And any questions before we open up the breakouts about what we're doing, what we've done so far? So just to recap, you only need to touch the app.js file. And at this point, I think you should only be adding methods inside your game object. So we've already fleshed out the window.onload and created our game object. So you should only be working inside this game object. All right, cool. I'm going to put you in the breakouts. We'll meet back maybe around 12, 35 or so, and see how you guys are doing. So just ping me if you have any questions, and I will open up our breakouts right now.